So Charles Waldheim is a Canadian-American architect and urbanist. He is John E. Irving Professor at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, where he directs the School Office for Urbanization. He holds a Bachelor of Design from the University of Florida and a Master in Architecture from University of Pennsylvania. His research examines the relations between landscape, ecology, and contemporary urbanism. He is author, editor, and co-editor of numerous books on this subject, including his latest book called Landscape as Urbanism. Waldheim is recipient of the Rome Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Rome, the Visiting Scholar Research Fellowship at the Study Center of the Canadian Center for Architecture, and the Cullinan Chair at Rice University, and the Sanders Fellowship at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you so much, Marcella, and thanks to all of you. Marcella has already very kindly made a series of acknowledgements and introductions, and so I won't repeat them. But as we're getting the slides together, I just wanted to say how very grateful, very happy I am to be back here at the Cattolica. This is a very special place. For me personally, I think it's among the most important nodes in architectural culture and discourse in the world. And I was very pleased to be here about a year and a half ago in this space to talk more about my own work and my own interest in this. And so it's very happy occasion to be back here with so many friends and colleagues. Following that conversation a year and a half ago, Marcela Ramos and Felipe Verda proposed the idea of doing something more specific around the discourse of landscape as urbanism, and to think of it somehow more broadly. And so that's really the genesis, as much as anything else, of this particular series of events. And it's also depended upon very, very deeply the support of the other institutions here in Santiago, Jeanette Sordi, our team, Luis Callas in Colombia, and the GSD, and our own Helen Kongsgaard. So thanks to all of you for all of your help. So the first thing that I would say is that this discourse, the notion of landscape as a medium through which to understand the city, in some ways now can speak for itself. It's a discourse that came out of a particular set of conversations in the last 15 years or so, and at the same moment is now available, both as a discourse and a set of practices really internationally. In this case, the most recent publication in this monograph form for me was a significant milestone in my own work, my own development, in the sense that most of the discourse, most of the practices around this concept have been developed through journal articles, they've been developed through competition entries, and a range of very productive forms, and yet we really have lacked to date something as a monograph, something really at book length. I don't mean to propose that I will have the last word on the subject, but I do want to suggest that for me it was important at least to be able to put in place something at book length that would consolidate the available knowledge. The other point that I would make about this is that in addition to consolidating the discourse of the last 15 years, it's been important for us also to reconstruct or revisit the history of these disciplines in a way so as to provide a slightly more useful history. While we think those histories are true, the book looks back at the 16th, 17th century, the origins of landscape as a medium. It looks back at the 19th century origins of landscape as a professional identity. And in revisiting those professional and cultural identities, tries to reconstruct, really re-engineer a little bit our conceptions of landscape, because it's my own sentiment that when I, as an architect, first stumbled into landscape, I somehow had been led to believe that it had something to do with plants. It had primarily to do with the aesthetic and decorative. And so the book attempts to make a larger argument, a larger historical argument around the idea that landscape has always been urban. And in this regard, I think this event and this series of events is a nice complement to Neil Brenner's remarks here a week ago. I don't want to say more in this space about the book project or about my own intellectual commitments, but I do want to situate that project in a broader set of territories. One of the reasons I think that Felipe and Marcela and others have proposed this particular tour is I think it's become clear to us that while Santiago has had a long-standing, as has the Catholic and other institutions, long-standing commitment to landscape as a medium, landscape as a framework, that's not something that I generally associate with the Americas. And of course, we have to make a number of disclaimers. There are, of course, many Americas. We've spent a lot of time in the last year trying to be careful and clear with our language, but we're really primarily here on a tour to kind of listen, to understand. This series of events is aided and abetted by a course at the GSD just now being led by my colleague Luis Callejas. The course and this series of events have the same mission, which is to ask a question. To what extent is this discourse or these practices of relevance here or not? On the one hand, while this discourse and its practices can be found in much of the developed world, Western Europe, North America, Asia, it's not entirely clear the status of these questions here in South or Latin America. And so we're here to listen, to gather information. The course at Harvard is now organizing a body of precedents, a body of literature, and is meant to produce a corpus so that we'll have more evidence around this question. And the series of events is meant to draw together people that have been working, and we've picked the 3 venues that struck us as the most fecund, the most ripe, that already have the most available evidence. And in this regard, Santiago has of course been our kind of base. This is already a conversation that's been here on the ground for many, many years. And in Medellin and in Brasilia next week, we feel as though we already see the evidence of something. But for us, I think it's important to still frame this as a question. Now, broadly speaking, in the Americas, the city has been conceived, among other things, through architecture. A very strong tradition of the architect as urbanist, a very strong, I would say, I would characterize it as a Mediterranean cultural inheritance, a tradition that's very strong and very significant. And at the same moment, I don't mean to suggest that that tradition precludes landscape education. Of course, here and in 1 or 2 other places across Latin America, we can see evidence of educational programs, university degrees, but it's very, very nascent. And so we're asking the question very, very broadly, what's the relationship between this discourse and what's happening on the ground here? Is there a relevance? On the one hand, is this conversation of landscape as urbanism a useful frame here or not? And when we look at the available evidence, what I've found so far is that in the context of the last 2 decades, across Latin America, we've seen, of course, a range of social and cultural and economic transformations. And as much as anything else, the social and political transformations have produced a kind of opening, and that combined with the economic conditions have enabled a range of practices. Most often these practices are focused by architects, most often young architects, I can say now being sufficiently middle-aged, and that these young architects, many of them, are using, if not landscape, but references to ecology, biology, a whole range of things that have been heretofore external to architecture proper. And so we're here on this tour, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, to ask that question. What to make of these practices that are emergent, and so we're gathering a range of professionals, a range of voices around these topics from here and elsewhere. And at the end of this series of events, at the end of the course in May, we're hopeful of making a publication and making a website and trying to gather available knowledge to be able to say, well, is there something like a landscape as urbanism in the Americas broadly? And if not, what other discourse, what other language should we be using to inform them? And the logic of the 3 venues, hopefully, is a little bit self-evident in that regard. The series is also, in another context, among the first activities of a new research entity that I wanted to spend just 2 minutes to introduce to you this morning. This is the Office for Urbanization at the Harvard GSD. My Office for Urbanization this year as a new research unit at the school. It's very nascent. We're just up and running. We have precisely a couple of months of work behind us now. And the Office for Urbanization, in addition to organizing this series, has as its ambition the idea of trying to focus applied design research in the school. And for us, it's been important to begin with trying to articulate what is the role of design as a framework for knowledge, as an epistemological lens, as distinct from architecture or landscape or urban design. And so in this regard, we've been rereading the Nobel laureate economist and political theorist Herbert Simon. Simon's book from 1969, The Sciences of the Artificial, we've been returning to. And his formulation that the sciences are primarily concerned with how things are, whereas design is concerned with how things ought to be, in that sense of design, in its aspirational, almost ethical sense of how the world might be structured, how the world might be or ought to be organized. And so our mandate is to build upon the school's history, to build upon the GSD's legacy by applying design research projects on questions of urbanization. Our mission is to imagine alternative and better futures. Our vision is to try to reduce the distance, the time lag between the impact of design innovation within the GSD and the impact of our students in the world. We know that the school has, of course, 75 years of design innovation. We know our students have had enormous impact in the world, and our goal with the mission of the office is to reduce the time lag between those two things. As has been said by our colleagues already, we know that urbanizations and questions of the city don't really correspond to traditional disciplinary or professional identities. And so it's that agonistic relationship, it's that dialogical relationship between disciplinary formation on the one hand. We don't want to develop a new discipline or a new profession every time we have a new challenge, right? We don't need a master's degree in the Zika virus. And at the same moment, we know that by definition, our disciplinary and professional identities are having a hard time keeping pace with the rate of change in the world. And so that, as an existential condition, is something that informs the work that we do. We're spending some time trying to define, both in the world but also on our campus, what do we mean by design research? What's the value of articulating that today? And in that regard, again, Simon has been quite helpful to us. Because, of course, our own Luis Callas's project and his partners with Paisajes Emergentes. Luis's practice in Medellin, this is his aquatic sensor project in Medellin, they were among the first practices of this kind, young architects practicing in Colombia to embrace the concept of landscape in their own identity as a firm. Their proposal, I think, for the Rio Olympics is equally illustrative of these ambitions. And so while it was the Paisajes Emergentes' initial framing of it that got my attention, we can now find this rubric available in the range of a number of practices around the region. Of course, Latitude is a very interesting practice. I think their project for the Medellin River I'm showing you here, which is underway just now, is a really interesting advancement at really adopting a series of landscape strategies. Their project, Unrealized, for the airport in Caracas is equally compelling in this regard. We had with us, of course, Camilo Restrepo in Medellin, and he presented his orchid house, which is as vivid an evidence we have, I think, in Latin America of this kind of fecundity of landscape or biological thinking. Of course, Camilo is interested in, among other things, or orders that come from the biological world, structures of space and thought that come out of the study of the natural world. And then Luis Callas's most recent project for Medellin, his proposal for the river, his competition entry, again, representative of a kind of landscape conception that's operant and available among a certain generation of architects working in Colombia today. I would also point you to the work of CAPA, another young architects collaborative, doing, I think, very, very interesting work in this space. Now, of course, we'll learn more over the course of today and tomorrow and the coming weeks and months with respect to the work that you're doing here in Santiago. I'm here very much to learn from you.
But I'm very pleased here to be able to invite my friend and colleague Alfredo Ramirez to join us here, given his engagements with the topic internationally, but also his commitments here more recently and locally. Of course, Alfredo, you'll recall, is the Mexican architect who's now leading the Landscape Urbanism Unit at the Architectural Association in London. I think Alfredo's work in and around Mexico in the last several years is indicative, again, of another example, another approach, another, I don't know what to call it, maybe landscape is the right frame to use here for a range of projects at a range of scales. In this regard, Alfredo's most recent Ground Lab collaborations with Leon Bosch and Danilo Martek and others here in Santiago are quite interesting to us. Again, I don't want to make great claims from this. We'll hear from the protagonists themselves, so I don't want to speak for them, but I do want to give you a sense of the kind of topos of this line of thinking. And equally in that regard, of course, you have other Chilean collaborators who are committed and already doing work in these areas that we'll learn more about these days. And of course, we couldn't do this series without connecting to our colleagues, our friends in Brazil. Of course, all of our friends also said, why are you going to Brasilia? My God, you have to do this in Sao Paulo, you have to do this in Rio. And of course, we've been in Sao Paulo a year ago, we've been in Rio 2 years ago, and these are important venues. But for us, Brasilia stands as evidence of a kind of alternative history. And in addition to work in the last 15 years across the Americas, we're interested to learn from you, to gather with us alternative histories from the 20th century. We do believe that there is work to be done to reconstruct a useful history, maybe an alternative history that some people will refer to. In this regard, of course, our colleagues Pedro Enrique de Cristo, Caroline Shannon de Cristo are with us here from Brazil, and their practice plus D are indicative of, again, these kinds of sensibilities in which I don't know precisely if landscape is the frame. Maybe it is. Maybe we'll hear from them and we'll learn more about that going forward. But what's the role of landscape thinking in restructuring infrastructure in the context of the non-formal? What's the role of landscape in constructing a more socially just, a more environmentally helpful set of environments? The practice known as UNA in Brazil is equally interesting to us. In that frame, we'll be meeting and hearing from them in Brazil. And their work both at the kind of urban set-piece, urban design scale, but equally at the kind of territorial and geographic scale is interesting to us in that regard. So I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I did want to give you a sense of the ambitions of the series. I would also invite you individually and institutionally to please reach out to us. This conversation is really just a beginning. We are hoping over the course of the coming weeks and months to assemble a kind of catalog of examples, both over the last 15, 20 years of the work of architects and urbanists working in this frame, but also to understand from you the relevant texts and literature that we need to understand more deeply, and equally the alternative histories within the 20th century and modernism that might be able to inform this project going forward. So thank you again for being here. We look forward to chatting with you. Thanks.